focus on the actual magical potentialities of that film which is made, that you're not just representing something, you are actually imbuing this artifact, this object, with the power that you are speaking about. So it's not so much a representation of it, but it's a manifestation of it.
No, it is a film. Zumba camera.
You don't have to look very far into, broadly speaking, the horror genre of the period to see a reflection of a widespread interest in, if not anxiety, in relation to new religious movements, we might say.
Hollywood is continuing to capitalize on society's growing craving for the occult and demonic.
One way to understand the culture of the late 1960s is to think about a burgeoning interest in occult ideas, whether you see that in terms of, say, Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan, or whether you see that in terms of getting interested into things like mysticism and yoga and so on and so forth. And there's lots of examples of films that reflect this, moving from exploitation films to films like Rosemary's Baby by Roman Polanski. That's a film which is variously full of kind of anxieties in different ways, but I think it certainly did a lot to introduce certain elements of language, certain ideas to the general public.
I think with film, it comes out in different ways, doesn't it? There's the very commercial representation of the occult, which you see in standard horror films, where the occult is used as a vehicle to tell to show a series of frightening or shocking or disturbing sort of tableau, using the properties of film and the theatrical aspect of film to do that. Then there's the kind of countercultural experience of it, like the Jodorowsky's films, which are using sort of magic, ritual, the occult, to sort of use film as a tool for altering consciousness.
They represent them in a very spectacular, very performative way. And I don't mean performative in a way that's sort of artificial. I mean, in the sense of Jodorowsky is someone who built those films out of a set of avant-garde performance practices. He was part of a group that referred to itself as the Panic Movement. It put on and mounted these kind of often very long, often very exhausting sort of happenings, as we might call them, that were based around, exploring corporeal extremity of one form or another. There was lots of blurring the line between reality and representation. Jodorowsky was very interested in creating a sort of real, actual experience for his audience. He was obviously often pushing at getting the audience involved, or actually getting the audience to feel a sensation beyond artificiality. And at the same time, he was also heavily involved with the tarot. He came to call his practice overall psychomagic, a sort of combination of divinatory practices using cards, but applying that as a form of psychotherapy. I think his films work from the same way. I mean, it gives him a much broader canvas to actually explore and to stage some of these images. They're much more kind of symbolic autobiographies, like he's actually trying to work through and bring to the surface a set of very personal and powerful archetypes. They often also take the form of destroying the self, and the films are at the same time kind of calls for that we may be living with a sense of a false self, or we may be living with a self that's imposed by others or absorbed from another form of projection. So in order to kind of move on to realize our true selves, we may have to undergo some kind of potentially traumatic sense of purgation in some way. So I think that accounts for a lot of the images of kind of death and rebirth and decay, and lots of very kind of intensely organic images in Jodorowsky's films, which have often led him to be seen as kind of morbid But when you take a slightly closer look at some of those images, they're often images of intense vitality. He's interested in kind of sprays of blood and bodies opening up and bodies turning into something else, and the way that decay is often full of life. The films are often working through these. They're working through these natural cycles, and they're plotting forms of transformation from one state of being to another, which is sometimes unpleasant, but ultimately extremely powerful for those involved. You might also call certainly the structure and the mode of representation of a film like The Holy Mountain quite explicitly alchemical. Certainly its primary set piece is entirely based around alchemical processes. Something that also comes out of The Holy Mountain is Jodorowsky's self-conscious interest in film, which I guess is slightly different from someone like Kenneth Anger, who is a filmmaker, practicing magician, artist. He would probably refer to himself in something of a poetic tradition. But across the mid to late 1960s into the 1970s, he made a series of films which were very intensely ritualistic, full of very deep symbolism. Films like Invocation of My Demon Brother from 1969. And he also spent a long time working on a number of versions of the longer film he referred to as Lucifer Rising. And they were often linked very closely to mythical images, mythical figures. Anger was very much influenced by the work of the writer and poet and magician Aleister Crowley. They shared certain practical viewpoints, but they also shared what you might refer to as a wider paradigm, a wider sense that society, if not the world, was about to move into another plane of being, a kind of new age, if you will. And Anger's films of that period, particularly in the late 1960s into the 1970s, they both reflected those concerns. But what made him interesting, I think, and what made him stand out from a number of other films that you could point to at the time, which were about the occult and about esoteric ideas and took it as a theme, is that Anger sort of imbued his practice with these ideas. So when he was making a film, it was not so much a film about the occult. There was something occultic about him making that film. That's to say, he saw film as being a magical practice, because he felt that when he was actually making films, actually engaging in that cinematographic practice, that sculpting of light, and that capturing of it and transformation of it, that was a magical practice. His films were spells. Kenneth Anger is someone who uses the camera almost as a sort of magical wand, or like he's imbuing a magical text with some degree of intensity and energy. I think Jodorowsky is aware of the power of the camera, but he also wants to sort of reveal that to his audience, and sort of use that as almost a sort of living, breathing metaphor to say that, you know, life is unreal, and you can sort of make it how you want.
And then you've got the sort of avant-garde aspect, where how they saw film as a vehicle for the occult, or for ritual, to be used as a tool within the creation of ritual. Not necessarily for dark purposes, but just as another force, you know, to represent an aspect of human experience that we can't quite understand or comprehend. Film was seen as a tool that could maybe help to do that. So I think it comes out in different ways for different reasons, and I think it's always been a strong force in the history of cinema.
We are images, dreams, photographs. We must not stay here, prisoners. Goodbye to the Holy Mountain. Real life awaits us.